Welcome to this fourth segment of the California Public Utilities Commission's toolkit and webinar on guidance for individual members of the public regarding how to participate in the BEAD challenge process. In this segment, we're going to talk about the kinds of evidence that is required under the federal rules and the CPUC's plan for individual challenges that are provided by members of the public for submission by eligible challengers who are permitted under federal law to submit those challenges. It's really important to understand that there are very specific kinds of evidence that have to be submitted. A challenge in and of itself without supporting evidence cannot be accepted by the CPUC under federal rules. Rather, the evidence has to meet the evidentiary standards that have been met, and then there has to be opportunity for the broadband service provider whose claimed service has been challenged to be able to rebut. As a result, the types of evidence that can be submitted as part of the BEAD challenge is critically important and is the means by which a challenge will either be successful in that it'll be considered and engaged, or will simply not be approved to proceed to the rebuttal phase because there is insufficient evidence to support the challenge. So we talked a little bit in the second module of this set of toolkit materials about the types of challenges that can be made. And individuals may submit evidence for the following types of challenges. Is internet available? Speeds, the latency of the service, data caps that are placed on the service, the type of technology, and the fact that a location is served for business services only and residential service cannot be received there by an individual who lives there. What we anticipate is that the most common types of challenges that will be submitted by individuals are going to be for availability, whether or not internet is actually available at that location, and speed, whether it is available at that location at the speeds that are showing up on the national broadband map, and whether those speeds are accurate or not. Let's start with talking about the availability challenge, given how important it is. This challenge is important if the FCC map and the data that will be provided by the CPUC at the beginning of the challenge process, based on the timeline that we talked about in the third module of this toolkit. If the FCC map shows a location is served, but in fact, the individual knows that that provider does not provide service to that location. So in this example, you look in the map portal and you see that a particular company is shown as providing 100 by 20 megabits per second service to your address, which suggests that that address is served. However, you know that you had asked that provider to provide you service to that location several months ago, and that provider said, we cannot provide service to that location. In that case, you can submit an availability challenge where the communication from the provider saying we cannot provide service to that location is your evidence of the fact that your location is not actually served. You can also contest availability where a provider got the request from you and said they would do it, but declined to schedule or failed to schedule a service installation within 10 business days, or the provider asked for a considerable amount of funds in order to connect to your location. The communications with the broadband service provider are the critical source of evidence for your challenge. In this case, it might be an email that you received from the provider, a letter, or another communication. It might also be that you've gone to the provider's website, input your address, and the website has said we cannot provide service at that address. In that case, you will want to have a screenshot of the website or the email, and a copy, perhaps scanned, of the letter or a printed out email. It's critical to make sure that any evidence about date and time, as well as the sender, are on the communication so that there is as much information as possible, and it is possible for the CPUC to look at it and see when that communication was received or the website consulted. If the communications are more than a year old, you can always contact that broadband service provider again and refresh your request for service. If they again reply that they cannot provide you service or fail to schedule a service installation or request a high fee, you will then be in a position to use that communication as your evidence. So screenshots are obviously a very important way by which you can provide this evidence. And the screenshot would be simply from the provider website, where you go request service by putting your address into their portal for selling you service, and then you get a message that says that they cannot provide you service at that address. If you provide that screenshot with the address and information about the time and date at which you took that screenshot, that evidence will be enormously helpful to your challenge. It's important to note that when you are questioning availability through a challenge, it must be for an address that is in what is called the fabric data set. What that means is that that address is actually on the FCC map, which you can see through the portal. If the address at which you live does not exist in the FCC map, as unfair as it sounds, it is simply not possible to challenge that because the federal rules provide only for challenges and funding for locations that are addresses that are on the map. We cannot challenge the actual address. If it doesn't exist, we can only challenge whether there is service at that address or not. The challenge service must be one of the reliable broadband services that are part of the BEAD program definition, which were discussed in part 1 of this toolkit, in the first module of this toolkit, meaning fiber, cable, digital subscriber line, or fixed wireless. There must be a verifiable email address, and the scan or screenshot that you use must be high quality. It is important that it be readable and that it'll allow image to text conversions. Importantly, the screenshots or scans must include all of the relevant and important information for the challenge, including date, time, the service provider, web address, location address, etc., as well as the date. So now let's talk about speed challenges as opposed to availability challenges. This is what you challenge, not as an availability challenge based on the fact that there is simply no service at all to your address, but rather because what you have determined and have evidence of is that the speed that is being claimed on the map is too high, that indeed you are actually being served with lower speed than what is on the map, and you cannot get a higher speed even if you were to pay for it. So an example of this would be a speed test, that you run a speed test from your home and demonstrate that the actual speeds are considerably lower than what is being claimed on the map. So speed challenges should be used where you find that the speed at a given location is actually lower than what the FCC map is showing, that the FCC map is showing speeds of 100 by 20 megabits per second or higher. And in fact, your experience is that speeds are lower than 100 megabits per second in the downstream direction, or lower than 20 megabits per second in the upstream direction, and or both. So example, the map, the portal, shows that the company can serve all of the homes in your neighborhood at 100 by 20, but you know that at your address, the speed tests you take show you at 30 by 5, or some other number that is lower than 100 by 20. You can then submit evidence of that speed test for a speed challenge to ask that the location be reclassified from served to underserved. That is to say, not at 100 by 20 or higher. Now, speed test evidence is relatively easy to gather because there are many speed test tools that you can use to take speed tests, and the list of those that are approved for purposes of the challenge process are on the right there in the blue box. They include Ookla, MLab, Cloudflare, and Netflix. They also include a speed test module that will be on the web page where you can submit your individual challenges. So you can do this all at one site. You can go to that web page, take the speed test, and then submit it as evidence for your challenge. And you see here for Ookla, MLab, Cloudflare, and Netflix, you see the URL or the web address where you can go to take those speed tests and grab that data. Now, while it is easy to take a speed test, it's important to know that it is actually, under federal rules, quite complex and important that the speed test be taken in the right way and in the right form. It can't just be any speed test. It has to be done in a rigorous fashion that meets the federal evidentiary requirements. Otherwise, it can't be considered adequate evidence for a challenge. There is a checklist of speed test requirements that have been provided by NTIA, and you can see there is a way to access those online. But the important thing to know is that the speed tests have to meet one of the form requirements that you see here on this page: a reading of physical line speed from a residential gateway, a reading from that residential gateway web interface or broadband service provider's web page, or a speed test performed on a personal computer within immediate proximity of the residential gateway using NTIA-approved speed test applications. Those are the ones you see on your right. The evidence must include the name, time, date, IP address, street address, and the certification of the speed tier subscription. More on that, which is that it must be clear that you subscribe to at least a 100 by 20 megabit per second product. But even better if you subscribe to the highest speed plan. What this means is that if you take a speed test and show that you can only get 50 by 10, but 50 by 10 is the product to which you are subscribing, that does not constitute adequate evidence of the fact that the provider cannot deliver 100 by 20. because you are not buying 100 by 20, your speeds actually received are assumed to not be 100 by 20. If you are contesting whether they can deliver 100 by 20, you can only do so if you can show that you are actually subscribing to services of 100 by 20 or higher. NTIA has been very strict about the rules for speed test requirements. Much as with availability challenges, that location has to be in the fabric. In other words, if your location does not show up on the map, there's simply no location that can be considered for BEAD purposes under the federal rules. And it must meet the definition of reliable broadband. Said otherwise, you must be testing fiber, cable, digital subscriber line, or fixed wireless. And importantly, for each address, it's insufficient to submit evidence of only a single speed test. You must submit 3 different speed tests from that location, taken on 3 different days. Those days can be any time between 60 days before the challenge process begins and the end of the challenge process. So you have quite a bit of time in which to take those speed tests, but you must demonstrate that you took 3 from the same address on 3 different days in order to provide the speed test requirements. In addition, when you think about those 3 speed tests, what you will be providing as the speed, your actual speed experience, is the median value of both the upload and the download. The median being, in this case, the middle. So long as the median value qualifies as below the metric for service, so 25 by 3 for unserved, 100 by 20 for underserved, those speed tests then are evidence that can support a challenge. How do you calculate the median? Well, if you have taken 3 speed tests on 3 separate days, you would look at the 3 download speeds that you took on those 3 separate days, and the one in the middle is your median. Of the 3 upload speeds, the one in the middle is your median. Your median speeds for each are thus the middle value for both upload and download. And so long as one or both of those values is below 100 by 20 or below 25 by 3, they qualify, all 3 speed tests together qualify as evidence for a challenge. Let's talk now about the other challenge types, although we think these will be less likely to be the most commonly provided challenge types by individuals who wish to participate in the challenge process. Despite that, they are important challenge types. So first one, data caps. In this case, what you would be submitting as your evidence is a screenshot or a letter or an email or something else that demonstrates that the service that you have been provided limits how much you can use that product. So you might have adequate speed, but if you use a lot of data at those speeds, you will be capped and will then your internet service will be either slowed or cut off for the rest of your billing period. If you provide that information, it qualifies as data cap information. The next challenge type is latency. In this case, you would be showing the round trip latency, that is to say, the length of the how long it takes for the communication to take of that broadband service, and you would be showing that it exceeds 100 milliseconds. A speed test will show that latency, and in the event that your speed tests demonstrate latency in excess of 100 milliseconds, you have potential evidence for a latency challenge. The next type of challenge is business service. In this case, what you would show is that you live at a residential address, but the provider's website is showing you only business service. The provider's website is saying that the products available are business services and they are not offering the kinds of services that are generally available to residential households. The next type of challenge type is technology. So you look at the website and it shows that you have fiber service to your home, but you know that actually you are served over DSL in one hypothetical. What you do then is you provide evidence, including manufacturer and model number of the equipment that the provider has put at your home so you can receive their service, as well as potentially photographs showing that the service is delivered by a technology other than the one that is claimed on the map, and you are thus challenging the claims on the map. It is really important to remember that evidence has to fit into these federal rules. The CPUC is not in a position to consider challenges that are backed by evidence that is not going to meet the standards that have been set out by the federal government. And that includes, just a quick summary, for availability, the evidence has to be relatively recent. Scans and screenshots have to be machine readable, thus high resolution, and all of the relevant information to allow the CPUC to analyze and evaluate your challenge has to be included. With regard to speed challenges, the speed tests have to be taken on different days, and they have to use approved speed test websites such as Ookla, MLab, Cloudflare, and Netflix, or the one that will be available on the CPUC website that is provided for individual challenges. The speed tests have to be taken from the correct location, and they have to include all the relevant and necessary information. Unfortunately, all of these evidentiary requirements are very strict, and while they require quite a bit of effort to submit a challenge, the CPUC, like all the states, will not be in a position to consider any challenge that does not have evidence that meets these federal requirements. The CPUC is doing its very best to build and execute the fairest and most transparent process possible to enable individuals to participate in this program and to enable the public to understand the challenge process. As a result, the CPUC will post all of the submitted challenges and rebuttals so that they are publicly available before it makes its determinations about the outcome of challenges and before they are submitted to the federal government for review and approval. What is posted will include which eligible challenger, local or tribal governments, nonprofits, broadband service providers, have submitted the challenge, which census block group the challenges appear in, who the challenged party is, the type of challenge, and a summary of the challenge, including whether there was a rebuttal or not. No personally identifiable information about any individual that provides a challenge with evidence will be posted. So let's quickly talk about next steps and what is coming for this process. There are a number of things that you can do to prepare for and engage in the challenge process. You can check the data on the FCC map and check to see whether the speeds and availability are accurate regarding your home or your office or small business location. You can take speed tests and start to gather data that you will then be able to submit through the challenge evidence submission website. And you can collect other evidence, including evidence that you reached out to a provider for service that the FCC map purports does serve your address, but that provider declined to provide you service, or did not schedule installation within 10 days, or quoted a high amount for installation to your location. Thank you very much for your attention, we look forward to continued information to be provided as part of the CPUC's execution of the BEAD program.